fund you, and therefore you have
Yes.
to pay for it yourself, or that you seek external funding?
No, you pay for it yourself, your own
Mhm.
cheddar, as in your
Yeah.
bank balance
Yeah.
is funding it.
I mean, I would say don't, for multiple reasons. I mean, the first is just so the first is that, like, a PhD is a job, right? It is a job. So, like, don't take a job that doesn't pay you for all the reasons that you shouldn't do it, right? Like, you're being exploited, right? The other thing is that, like, there's that piece of, uh you should think of the PhD as a job, not as a degree program, um which is also something I think Europe's better at. Like, so at my university, a PhD is a job, right? It's like, it's posted on the job board. It's not posted on a degree program board. But the other piece is about the predictors of success, right? And the predictors of success is being in a strong environment with strong support and a strong advisor. And so the types of places that won't be willing to, like, if you see a PhD program that won't fund its PhDs, you're looking at a PhD program that is not going to support you in all the other ways that are important, right? I might be wrong, and this might be country dependent, but at least in continental Europe, what the systems I'm familiar with here, and in the US, I'm confident in saying this. I can't speak to the UK because I know the UK has different funding structures, but in, like, the Netherlands and Germany, where I'm familiar with how the system works, and in the US and Canada, if you're looking at a PhD program that does not fully or almost fully fund their PhD students, you're looking at a program that is not serious about supporting you in general. Um, and that either means, like, that's just not something that they care about, or they just don't have the resources, right? If they don't have the resources to fund you, they also don't have the resources to fund your research. They also don't have the resources to do everything else. So I would pretty universally advise against it for that reason. Like, not just because, like, it's not something that should happen in the first place, but because to me, it's a strong signal of the quality or lack thereof of the program itself. Um, Now, I think there are ways to get independent funding. And I think, a lot of, in terms of what one calls funding, that's also kind of amorphous, because, like, a lot of places, you get a small stipend, and then then you teach, or, like, so, maybe on paper you're only kind of partially funded, but functionally you're getting the equivalent of someone who's fully funded because you're teaching, right? So it's like, there is some of that, of, like, what it looks like on paper versus reality, right? Like, so, you get a job, and you have a salary, and you have a contract, and you're unionized. But as part of your contract, you have to do teaching, right? Which is not directly compensated, right? So you get a fixed salary, and then you have to teach, versus, like, other universities where you have on paper you have a salary which is lower, stipend, but then you teach, and that pays you directly. And so, like, functionally that person's getting as much as someone over here. The system looks different. But if you're not right, if you're not a program that is serious about supporting you, is a program that'll pay for you. And in terms of the systems I've been a part of, I'm pretty confident saying that. Yeah. And to the point where, at least in the US, like, I would go as far as to call places that don't fund PhD students is, like, almost predatory, right? That those are places, if you're telling someone they have to pay for it themselves, then that's probably a more predatory program.
Mm. Interesting. Now to go into a different one, which is scholarship then. Do you think it is better for somebody to apply for a scholarship for a PhD program? And what are the benefits of doing so?
So when you say scholarship, you mean something independent from the university?
So it could be independent from the university. It could be, this is the element where you're saying, what does funding mean?
Yeah.
Essentially, because it has different, contextually, it means different things. So it could be that the university, they've said, right, we're embarking on this journey. We've got some EU funding, for example, within the environment sector, and this is what we have, or DEFRA, or whomever, and then they go out to recruit
Yeah.
in terms of PhD students, which is known in Germany, hence why they have a contract, or in the Netherlands, etc. Whereas different universities, for example, with the self-funding question, like I'm self-funding. So I've written my question and I said, I want to research this because this is what I want and I'm taking it forward. Whereas
Yeah.
somebody would say, I want to migrate, and that's the quickest way to get into that country, which is through that PhD program. Because once I'm in there through the PhD, now I have opportunity to then change my livelihood and my
Yeah.
families as well back home.
Yeah, so I would speaking so like I can speak to the US here because I at least in the Netherlands like that sort of the idea of like a secondary scholarship is not common because it's all sort of wrapped up into your salary. But in the US that's more common. And so like what I said before, it's
Mhm.
often an artifact of a patchwork system, which is not great. And so if you're looking at that, what you want to try to discern is it might look patchwork on paper. How patchwork is it in reality, right? So, like, let me compare two hypotheticals, right? So, let's say there's one program which gives you, right, you get your PhD, you get a PhD there, you get a small stipend. Let's say like it's measly. Let's say it's like 15,000, like not really livable. But then all the PhD students get a scholarship, which is again like maybe you're expected to teach, and the scholarship pays you another 15,000, right? So that's annoying that it's patchwork, but that's good, right? That's they've through a patchwork system they've constructed what is the most common, which is that students make not good money, but argue maybe a livable wage, and they're teaching, right? That's what most PhD students end up doing. However, I have seen programs um, and again, I think the important thing here is to try to infer how the program is going to support. I have seen programs that have done that, but rather than all students getting that scholarship, only some do. And that's like a competitive thing. And so, what, and that, if you see something like that, that should signal an environment that is going to pit you against other students and is going to constantly evaluate you as to whether or not they will actually support you. And if you don't succeed in that competition, you're screwed, right? You don't get the scholarship, you don't have anything close to a living wage, right? And I have heard of PhD programs like that, and I actually remember deliberately choosing not to apply to them. These programs where they're competitive programs, the rather like, and that's just that to me that seems like such a toxic environment. Like I don't want to be in that environment. But even if one doesn't see it as toxic, it to me it signals that like the program is not invested in your success from day one, right? It means that the program is trying to weed you out, right? The program is admitting a large group of students, and then it's going to pit you against each other, and then it's going to select the ones that it thinks are the winners, and it's going to let everyone else languish and fall between the cracks. And you should try to avoid, in my opinion, that's bad. That's bad. That's like it's immoral in and of itself, but it's also just like bad. It's bad for good science, right? Good science is about collaboration. You shouldn't be pitting students against each other, right? You should be admitting people and supporting them from day one. So if there are scholarship programs and they're like highly competitive and they're really just the ways in which departments like discriminate between the students that they actually want to support and the students they're going to leave behind, to me that's a red flag relative to programs which say we're highly competitive. We only admit a certain number of students, but if you get admitted, you have guaranteed full funding for 4 to 5 years, right? It's not contingent on some exam at the end of year one or year two, right? It's a job with a contract functionally, and here's what the contract looks like. Um, so that's how I think of these things is like what do these structures signal about how the program values you and intends to support you. And that's not to say like the correlation is not one to one. There are places that are cash strapped that will support you, right? And they are cash strapped at no fault of their own, right? And it can be really hard to discern between those, right? Which is why I think one of the best pieces of advice a PhD student can get is talk to other PhD students in the program, right? Ask them what it's like on the ground. Ask them, is this an environment where everyone's in it together, even though no one has money? Or is this an environment where money is dangled over you as a threat to get you to be more productive, right? And you want to avoid the latter, because I think that's an unhealthy scientific environment. Um, and so for my advice for people would be that like go in with that eye of what does this signal about the program and how it's going to support you. And if you're worried that it's signaling something bad, get as much information from existing doctoral students as you can to either confirm or disconfirm that, and act accordingly.
No, I think, what you're saying is very logical because it is a difficult market to navigate through in the sense of the variables, they differ and it's environmentally led,
Yeah.
and the people in there and the purse strings behind
Yeah.
closed doors. So the challenges are unique and there is no right or wrong way. Hence why we're having this conversation in
Yeah.
the sense of there's trials and tribulations, whichever way we look at it, because when you get in, it's that into it. It's
Yeah.
that maze and you have to navigate through.
And it's worth, it's worth situating my experience in the US, right? So the US has fully comprehensive PhD programs. There are benefits to that. There are downsides to that. Um, but for me, it makes these calculations more high risk, right? Unlike because for like if a viewer's watching, they know what I'm talking about. So in the US, a PhD program is typically 5 to 6 years. You are admitted the first 2 years are full-time teaching, and then after 2 years, you start to focus on your dissertation, and you spend 3 to 4 years doing your dissertation. That is not what it's like in Europe. So, for example, in the Netherlands, most people do a research master's, which is 2 years of full-time coursework, and then typically go to a separate program, not always, but sometimes go to a separate program, and then do their PhD, which is just the dissertation. Usually no
Mhm.
classes or very few classes. So, like at the end of the day, those two people have gotten different training, and this is also why this conversation like goes back and forth. So, like or rather, like it's worth thinking about these differences. So, like in the US, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. So, I advise people to be very sensitive to what the basket is. I suspect the UK system is different. It's much more like the Netherlands, where it's like the PhD is the dissertation, but you're often entering the PhD with either an existing master's or other work and the PhD has much less coursework, certainly not 2 years of coursework. And in that case, then calculation's a little different, right? Because you know, the risk, there are higher risks with putting all your eggs in one basket, right? In terms of failing, in terms of the time commitment, right? So like, you know, the question, like the previous question about like self-funding for 5 years is very different than self-funding for like 2 or 3. Now I still like I think there's issues with it, but these calculations are a little different, and it's worth considering that. So I just want to situate my experience in the U.S. and why I give this sort of stark advice because in the US, you are putting all your eggs in one basket. You really don't have another option. Whereas in the Netherlands, for example, you do have other options, right? It's not uncommon to see PhD students sort of change positions. That's pretty rare in the US. And you have the opportunity to also scope out the environment, right? So like there are research master students here, right? And they'll get to know us and we get to know them, right? And so they will know whether they want to stay here or they want to go somewhere else for their PhD. So, I mean, that's one thing to consider too, is are all these different systems and how they interact, right? One of the benefits of the US system is that you get much more exposure to your advisor, right? And so you're going to have a much stronger relationship with someone you worked with for 6 years than someone you worked with for 3 years. So it's less fragmented. And while that can mean higher risk in terms of the environment being not productive, not good, it means higher reward if you are good, right? If you spend 6 years in a place which is amazing and super supportive, you're going to come out really well and probably be doing better than someone who spent 1 to 2 years in one master's program and then only 3 years in another PhD, different countries. So it's the way that the different systems work is one thing to consider as well. Um, and when you think about these things, and it's also like very country specific too. Like you said, like some systems are patchwork, some systems are not. I talked to the PhD students I know in the UK. It sounds like the funding is awful, right? When I say it's like, how do you live? It's like, oh, everyone consults is the response I get. And I was like, that's not a good system. um, you know, yeah, versus like I think the Netherlands does it really well to the Netherlands' credit, right? It's a full-time job with a contract, with a delineated salary, with a clear beginning and end point, with clear terms, with a union, right? Like, and it pays well. It pays basically like it pays like a good paying job that someone could get out of college or with a master's. So, uh, to the credit in the Netherlands where it's due, but in other systems, it's a much more patchwork system. Um, and unfortunately too, like this again with one of the values of the show like this is like they're totally opaque. Like I know almost nothing about the UK system, right? All I know is what I've heard, and because it's so opaque, this is sort of a through line of what I've been saying. You need to talk to someone in the system. Like you need to make sure you understand how the system works, so you don't get tripped up. You don't miss crucial social norms or crucial systems of support or crucial expectations, or the reality on the ground of what these systems actually look like and how they actually like manifest or poorly manifest. Yeah, and so it's and actually I've alluded to this conversation I had last week. This is the thing. This was a guy in the U.S., but he wanted to be in Europe, and I warned him. I was like, the PhD system in Europe is very different than the U.S., so do not assume that your understanding of the structures of the U.S. system generalized to Europe. Definitely find someone. They wanted to go to the UK or Italy, and I was like, definitely find someone in the UK or Italy to talk to, because you absolutely want to be sure you're not walking into something that you don't understand.
Yeah, I think to your point, they are valid in many ways than one because the system may be different, but the challenges they seem to mirror each other. And like you said, you don't know much about the UK, but there's so many nuances within the universities. So if I can't sit here genuinely and say I know everything, because the challenges they differ, and within the UK, as you've mentioned previously, we've had a lot of redundancies. So everybody's uncertain, right?
Yeah.
From the top all the way to bottom. But we're still getting students in every September, or April, whenever they're joining the universities. So it's very difficult for everybody because the uncertainty is so high, and decisions are being made behind closed doors by those who make decisions, but the impact of that it's far greater because it's the teaching quality. If I'm anxious and petrified, what am I actually stating to those who are listening to me, even if I'm supervising a DBA, because I'm so uncertain. Like you said, you've had to uproot and come to the EU. Same for us as well. Now you have to go to the north. You've never been to the north because it pays and there's a job. So it's a challenge for everybody mentally. And thank you so much for disclosing, because I think even though you're saying it's US specific, it's actually globally specific in that sense because it's impacting the one thing that we need. We need money to pay for B or for A or for C. And that has a huge impact in terms of our mental health. Now, to move on to your research then, that you've shared with me, the question that I have is, you're looking at socially responsible capitalism, right? And you've looked at the far right and the far left. What intrigued you about this, and how did we end up here?
So my core interest is in like why people have inaccurate beliefs, particularly about other people,
Mm,
right? So not just like do people know something true about the policy, but also like what are people's sort of like mental scapes of social reality. And I think there's a tendency perhaps understandably, but also perhaps induced by stereotypes in the media, to assume that like on these dimensions where we perceive clear differences between the left and the right, that therefore that like the distribution is normal, right? So like, oh, people on the right don't think climate change is real, people on the left do, therefore 50% of the population thinks climate change is not real, 50%, right? And so the error there is assuming because like there is a spectrum that the distribution is normal. And it's often not. So like climate change is the perfect example, and things like climate change are a perfect example where you often have super majorities who the sort of takeaway is that you have these super majorities who think they're the minority, right? So you have Democrats saying to themselves, "We're the only people that care about climate change," which is not true, and you have Republicans saying to them, like survey data consistently shows that even the majority of Republicans really care about climate change, and if you ask everybody to estimate that. So if you ask Republicans to estimate how much other Republicans support climate change, if you ask independents, if you ask Democrats, everyone like gets it wrong by like half. They underestimate the proportion by like 50%. Like they think it's like 20% of Republicans and it's like 55% of Republicans. And that creates, when you have a context where a supermajority thinks they're the minority, they don't act. There's sort of a spiral of silence, both at the individual level, right? So, like, quite literally, you might have, if you have a group of Republicans who are together, they might all silently think that the Republican Party should do more about climate change, but because they think everyone else doesn't think that, no one says anything. But you also get that at the leadership level, right? And there's also data on this. These are biases that don't only exist in the in the average citizen, right? There's research showing that like legislators also hold these biases. They vastly overestimate the extent to which their voters hold the stereotypic opinion of their party. Um, and so in these domains of like climate change and social responsibility of corporations, we thought we would see this in this domain, and we do, right? So we see the main finding is that in most instances of corporate social responsibility, people underestimate the extent to which the general population supports it. And it's only in like the most sort of polarized one where people don't underestimate or are pretty accurate or even overestimate it. So like, what was the one? I think it was the DEI one. We use multiple examples, all of real corporations, like real policies they have. So like real net zero policies from different organizations, health and safety policies, other CSR policies, ESG policies. Um, and across most of them, underestimation is pretty universal, like for in-group and for out-group. And so when we think about, again, in to generalize the example of a legislature to like a board, right? Boards are going to have the same problem. They like when you're, if the core of corporate strategy is like thinking about stakeholders, right? Like who are your stakeholders? Who are your customers? Who are your suppliers? What are shareholders thinking, right? What are regulators thinking? You have to try to guess what they will think based on your behavior, how they will react to something, and then act accordingly, right? And there's a ton of uncertainty there. So the scientific proposition is not that like people are perfect. People are just bad at this period. Like it's hard. But if they're systematically bad at this, if they're systematically biased in one direction, then that's a different problem, right? It's one thing just to be uncertain and make a guess and be wrong in either direction. But if you're constantly, if you're saying to yourself, all these stakeholders don't care about sustainability when they do, right? You're either going to make a decision that makes people angry, or you're just going to miss the opportunity for like shared value creation, right? Where it's like, oh, we would all want to do this. If we did this, our stakeholders would value it. They would reward us for it. We would all be on this. We would all be happier, right? But we're missing that opportunity for collaboration and for like collective betterment because the decision makers incorrectly assume that other people don't hold those values, right? So that's the concern in domains related to climate change and corporate social responsibility, and the data in the paper support that. And I see this in other data too of like So I've extended this research on, so you're talking about the published paper, but I have other
Mhm.
papers that are ongoing right now that get much more concrete. It's like, okay, so like these, it's one thing to talk about general values, but let's talk about specifics. Let's get down to like specific policies. Let's talk about so I just with sustainability of people, they write about what their organization does, they tell us what they want their organization to do, and then you still see the same bias that the people are very capable of saying, I wish my organization did more, and everyone thinks that no one else supports that, which can't be true on average. It can't be true on average that like what everybody wants on average, everybody doesn't want on average, right? And so you just see, even when you get really specific, you see this spiral of silence of people don't advocate, right? And the extent to which and we have data showing that like the extent to which people underestimate others' preferences actually predicts their own behavior. So not just like cheap talk on surveys, we actually have companies report what policies they have, and we find that the owners of the companies who have this downward bias to assume that other owners don't care about sustainability, they themselves have fewer sustainability policies in place. So the bias actually predicts existing behavior. And so I think it's worthwhile to know what that bias looks like, to be able to measure it robustly, to know what predicts it, so that we can then intervene on it, to help people act more in line with their values and act more in line with what their stakeholders want.
That's really interesting, when it comes to stereotype and bias and the assumptions that we do make as individuals. I guess the question that I have is, now that we've realized that the assumptions are similar or the same, how do we then educate that community to say, actually, it is the same, don't fear, just say it as it is? Like, how do we get that across?
Yeah, it's hard because I mean you can educate people and
Mm,
you can show that interventions work in the short term. Like people do update, right? People are rational and so they get new information, they update. But the problem is, right, the reason they hold these stereotypes is because of the information environment. Right? So like climate change is a really good example, right? And a lot has been written about the way in which, for example, the media, sort of both sides the debate, right? And so it presents, in trying to be objective, presents both sides of the debate, but ends up basically platforming what is an extreme minority opinion, both scientifically, but also in terms of the population. And so, you can give people concrete information, but then when they return to an information environment where small minority opinions are given a lot of influence, or extreme opinions, right? So opinions that are we can differentiate between those things, like opinions that are not extreme per se, but just like not they're a small minority opinion, or opinions that we would consider extreme, right? Those tend to get more attention on social media, get more attention in traditional media, and so they just then reinforce the stereotype that those sorts of opinions are more common, which is then what leads to the sort of status quo bias, right? Of just like, well, we shouldn't change, we can't change because no one supports change, um, in these regards. And so, in the corporate context, I think it's about changing the information environment, right? So it's you can just tell them this, but of course, if they're interacting with stakeholders more, so helping to sort of burst the bubble, to say like, look, right, it's not just here's data, but it's like if you start this partnership, right, you're going to actually start to see that other people hold these values as well. And so like especially in sustainability, like corporate partnerships can matter. Sharing information is big because I think within sustainability there's just so much uncertainty. Like I have a paper I'm writing, and like the title of it is like, we don't know what we're transitioning to. It's like everyone wants to be involved in energy transition, but then it's like, what does that actually look like for your organization? Most organizations say like, we have no idea, right? Even the organizations that are in the energy sector, even the organizations which have committed meaningful resources, public and private, to being part of the energy transition, there's just so much uncertainty about what that actually looks like. And so not only is there inherent value in organizations exchanging information, there's also the normative value in terms of signaling what's normative within the community. Of like, oh, guess what? Like, not only are other organizations struggling with this, but other organizations care like we do, right? They're struggling because they care, because they're trying. And so exposing people rather than just like top down, like here's a here's a scientific information campaign or a public relations campaign, right? Those can have limited value, but like what people really need is to be repeatedly interacting with peers in a way in which these values are explicated, right? That's how you truly burst the bubble, right? Is you start talking to people rather than just like getting information from the social media environment.
So I guess the question I have is when it comes to social media, is that a big problem for our community at large? Because we know that they have these farms where people can have an agenda and that's what's being pushed out, not looking at the traditional media, but specifically social media. Do you think, because that has a huge impact on the younger generation, as you've seen with Australia, they've said, okay, let's do away with social media for kids. It
Mm.
doesn't mean that some kids won't try and get on it, but at least there's governance. What are your thoughts in terms of that? Because you plant the seed early, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think there's a moral panic about social media, which is in some respects a moral panic, which needs to be tampered down. And in some respects, like it's hard because I think there is good data that it's a problem, but it's worth like articulating where the problem lies. And I think, I think the idea that, so, as I mentioned before, right, it's peer interaction. So
Mhm,
it the problem isn't so much the fact that I pick up my phone and like the information on my phone goes in my brain and affects my brain. That does happen. The problem is that I'm spending more time on my phone than I am with human beings, right? So
mhm,
it's not just the information on this, it's that this is being it's the substitute for the much better interaction that'll actually give me
mhm,
a better view into what other normal human beings think. So that's part of it. So it's just like it's the substitution for normal social interaction is one problem. And then there's the other ways in which I think social media. I actually think you think about types of people on social media. Like one of the problems with assuming social media is super bad is who we assume are on it, right? Um, and like we know the types of people who get most of their news from social media. It's like people who are really young and people who are really old, which is an interesting, right? Those are the two people, like in misinformation research, the two groups of people who are the most susceptible, right? And for different reasons. Like for young people, it's because they are the ones getting all their information from it. But for older people, they grew up in a generation where they could trust the information environment much more than they can today. And so they're not acculturated to the idea of like not trusting it. And so like older people and younger people fall for misinformation for different reasons. Whereas like our generation has a more diverse media diet, but also like is used to being more incredulous of the information they see on average. Um, so there's that piece of like the number. I think the real danger is like when social media drives these patterns among subsets of people who have power, right? So I can give you an example. And the number of times I have seen a news article or an opinion piece written solely about with the right like the discourse on Twitter, right? RIP Twitter. I loved Twitter when it existed, but you see so much competently written about general trends that people only see on social media, right? And that's a problem because you have this small group of powerful individuals like media elites, like people who write for the New York Times, and just like the problem with the average citizen is that they're getting like it's not just that they're getting their information only from this, they're not getting it from elsewhere. You see the same thing, right? And so I think like the way in which the way in which those stereotypes bubble upwards into the general population, I'm less concerned about the way they bubble up to everybody because like the average adult doesn't actually spend that much time on social media. It's like young people and people who are retired. But I think it bubbles up in really pernicious ways, and like it ends up driving discourse and ends up driving narratives that are just like totally divorced from reality, because like people see what happens on a place like Twitter, or see these debates that happen in these spaces that are profoundly non-representative of what the average person thinks, and then overgeneralizes. Um, and then now, of course, like with things like TikTok, like they're just designed to like feed you sort of information that you want to hear. Um, and I'm a strong believer in like, again, the best place, the idea that or said a lot of scientific experiments that have said, well, the problem is that people are in these echo chambers. Um, a lot of them find that people aren't actually in echo chambers, and because the problem is that people get people social media is not it's not a productive place to be exposed to counter attitudinal information. And so a lot of interventions that sort of assumed, oh, if we like pop the echo chamber and we expose them to the other side, they'll like integrate that new information. What actually happens, it just like pisses them off, right? And like it makes it worse, it makes it more polarized. And that's because like the social media environment is not like a social interaction. Whereas like if I right, so if the exact same words are being spoken by a colleague versus an anonymous person on Twitter, I'm going to get really angry. When I see it on Twitter, I'm just going to get angry at it. It's going to polarize me more. But when a colleague says it, I'm actually going to listen, right? I'm going to engage with it. So it's not about the information per se as much as it is the social environment. And so like I'm in the process of like writing grants for new research about politics in the workplace. And my big argument in that is that the push to keep politics out of the workplace is bad, because the workplace is now one of the few places in society where you are likely to get spontaneous, unpolarized, counter attitudinal information in a way that you might be receptive to it, right? As people's other social circles, become more online based, the workplace is still like that. And so, if we take the view that like being exposed to opposing views by a human being in a human context is still the best, most productive way to bridge divides, we want to then identify those contexts and strengthen the likelihood that those interactions will happen. And I would argue that the workplace is probably the most likely context for that to happen. And rather than saying we should strip politics, we should like ban political speech from those contexts, and say, no, we should actually encourage that carefully, because of course that can go wrong. There's a lot of ways that can go wrong. But examining the workplace as we would say in science, as a context of cross-cutting ties, where people have these relationships that, because they're not based on social affiliation and therefore highly correlated with sharing, like someone sharing the attitudes that you share, it can be a really fruitful environment for that sort of process. And so I'm currently trying to write grants to sort of examine that, and very much like measure people's misperceptions, these stereotypic misperceptions, and then try to show that workplace interactions related to politics can actually pop those bubbles.
Mm. Very insightful. And I think, to your point, to say we exercise caution with work politics, because again, as you're in the EU, when it comes to mental health, it is a big thing and it costs businesses a lot of money. So I think, like you said, decision makers, they always weigh the pros and cons behind closed doors and be like, oh, we can't afford this, it's not in the budget. But, in terms of the next question then, do you think higher education, now you've relocated and you're globetrotting, breaks the poverty life cycle? Or do you think, no, Noma, it's not a thing?
I mean, I think there's a data-driven answer, which is it is still, right? Getting a higher degree is still like one of the best ways for someone to increase their socioeconomic status. So like I think the data is still there to support that. And I think the extent to which that trend is diminished, I don't think is I don't think because academia per se has changed. Like, I think it's because it's become, uh, you know, what's the word? The barriers to entry are higher, right? Especially like in the United States, costs are super high. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's still, and there's talk about media narratives, right? There's all this talk about like educational polarization and like how many of these political fault lines are now being driven, but like they're falling along educational lines, which is half true. That is definitely happening, but I think that hides other trends. Um, but like so and that's still true today. So like having a college degree is still very strongly predictive of higher income, very strongly predictive of being in long-term relationships. So it's like very predictive of like successful marriage rates, very predictive of markers of happiness and mental health. And so if you're just going from like the data perspective, the answer is yes. But of course, how much of that is selection effect, right? Is it already the fact that people who are already wealthy and already have all the structures needed to actualize that sort of outcome? So I think a lot of it is selection. Um, but outside of financial burden, which is very real, I would never advise someone not to go to college if they couldn't, because I think it's both an intellectually important exercise, right? The one thing I mentioned before, um, there's a lot of educational fault lines that I think actually mask just like racial fault lines in the U.S. And other fault lines. But there is one thing that is really consistently shown, and um, it is that education predicts anti-authoritarian attitudes. So, like when you look at who votes for authoritarian candidates, either left wing or right wing worldwide, like typically the strongest predictor is education. The people with more education are less likely to vote for authoritarian candidates. And so I still think, outside of like economic arguments, utilitarian arguments, like I still think education is still one of the strongest bulwarks defending democracy, having an educated population. So.
Very interesting. You'll be glad to know that this is the final question. In your opinion, do you think PhD hard talk is beneficial for, the DBAs, PhD scholars out there and the universities as well? Or do you think, no, Noma, it's not working, call it a day?
No, no, no. I think it is. Um, I'm a big so like I remember my advisor told me once that like when you become a faculty member, you're immediately going to lose your ability to perspective take with graduate students. And I remember hearing that. Like I understand why that might be the case. Like her point was that like it's really hard to once you're in a position of power, like remember what it's like to not be. But what I took away from that is like I need to remember, right? And I am now a professional academic, but I still desperately cling on to old memories and always remind myself that academia is such an opaque place. If you haven't been here before, you have no idea what's going on, and that's not any fault to your own. Like like this, that's true of everywhere, and we forget how opaque it is. And so, I think anything that reduces that opaqueness is always going to be extremely valuable, right? And the only reason I was able to succeed in academia is like, well, this is why I'm here. This is why I'm here right now, and I'm looking at the clock and I'm seeing an hour 20, and I'm like, that's fine. The only reason I've been successful in academia is because other people have done this, because they have stopped and gave me the time to help me understand my environment, whether I was about to enter it or considering entering it or already there, right? And like I said in the beginning, this is true of most institutions, right? There's all these norms, idiosyncrasies, all these things that you never can truly understand until you're there. And academia is no different, if not maybe even harder, because it's like just such an opaque place, right? It's um, if you've worked in one company, that experience is going to generalize much more to another company than it is to academia. A lot of unique, weird idiosyncrasies. And so anything that pops that bubble is extremely valuable. which is why I'm very happy to be here, because I know how valuable being able to hear about people's experiences, and sort of have that raw view of what it's like on the inside. I think that's exceptionally valuable.
Thank you so much for your kind words and also your reflections, because your candidness is going to help 1 or 10 people. And the truth is, it is a maze and it's a difficult one. And also, if you don't have a support bubble, like you said, your wife, her career is not going to be what she envisioned it to be. So there's so many sacrifices that come with this choice. And often our families, they may not understand that it's solo, but their input keeps you going when you feel like giving up. And you've delivered the message, I believe, in a very clear, succinct manner. You've had comparisons in terms of the US, the Netherlands, and the UK. And again, those differences, they look like differences, but again, to me, it's just similar in that sense. So I'd like to take this opportunity again to say thank you so much for your time, Doctor, postdoc, assistant professor.
Thank
Jeff
you.
Lees, it's been wonderful. I never thought I would speak to someone who's been to Harvard all my life. So I have made it. So thank
Harvard is
you
not,
again.
it's having been to Harvard, it's there's a lot to say about Harvard, but it's not that different. Like, having taught at Harvard, having taught at public schools, like having bounced in and out of the Ivy League repeatedly, uh, you know, there are things that it's great with, but I think it's a lot closer to most universities, right? This is also advice I give to people too, which is like, th- shooting for prestige is not what's work. Like, what you should aim for is a supportive environment with a supportive advisor whose interests are aligned with yours, and you should absolutely privilege that over prestige or ranking. Those things matter, unfortunately, uh, but they matter in the eyes of others. Like, they matter in terms of like people looking at you and saying you have this degree. But what is still the best predictor of success, is the other thing. And like, I alluded earlier to like knowing about programs that were really competitive, like pitted PhD, like those were elite programs, right? Which I could have plausibly got it into. I could have, like, if I got into Harvard, I could plausibly get into those. But I said no, I don't want to apply to those, because I know at that point I had gotten this information of, it's like, that's what matters. Like, don't just look at prestige, look at alignment and look at support. Um, because yeah, being an academic is like the one thing that academia gives you is that intellectual independence, right? And you're only going to be able to actualize that independence if you're happy. It's going to be right. It's sort of like it's a force multiplier. And so if you're in a supportive environment, that independence is just going to make you feel amazing. And if you're in a crappy environment, that independence is going to make you feel miserable. um, and so really privileging the focus on that. And yeah, and unfortunately, prestige often correlates with like those really competitive, toxic environments, because prestigious places tend to attract competitive, toxic people. um, so that's a whole nother dynamic, which unfortunately exists everywhere. Right? That's true in any context where people are selecting on prestige, whether it's academia or the private sector or the government. So
Stay locked in for part 3, because I think there's a topic there and it's interesting. So stay locked in. Thank you again.
my pleasure, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. I hope you find this valuable. I hope lots of people see this. And if you're watching this and you're already at the end, thank you for spending the time. You can reach out to me. You can find me like Jeff Lees, and feel free to put my name and a link to my profile in the post here. So if anything I say resonates with them, they can reach out.
Be at the
Yeah,
bottom of the
links
video.
in the comments.